What I want to talk about is issues around how we might move the sort of agenda that Liam has introduced and which I had thought that Mark was introduced in terms of the sort of thinking that we need to be doing, mainly as lawyers and partly as ethicists, about the challenge of how we properly regulate the use of big data sets, electronic records, in a way that will maintain public confidence and allow them to go forward. And I learned a little bit earlier today that Mark wasn't going to be here. And this slide tries to capture what I guessed he would say and what I guessed he would think but probably wouldn't say. And the first bit around the sorts of opportunity to use electronic data to discover things that happen in real-life contexts, to do it on a scale that's really hard to do in a timely manner, and without exposing people to new things, but understanding what happens when they do what they're doing. It overlaps with Liam's list. But there's also a major set of things going on which are quite significant when I get towards the end of my talk in terms of the challenges we need to take this forward, that are also being said about the use of these sorts of data sets by government spokespeople as part of the life science strategy, which need to be thought through in terms of how they play out in terms of gaining public confidence in this. So one of the reasons why people are interested in being able to use electronic health records in the NHS for research is that it gives us a competitive advantage because we have a massive data set, if we can unlock it, which will encourage inward investment at times of economic challenge. It will also enable us to be able to find things out about the use of treatments and use of medicines much more quickly beyond the data that's needed to get them onto market, about how they're actually used, and therefore ask questions around whether or not things are cost effective. So there's a range of things going on, all of which are important and valuable, but play out differently in some people's minds as we work through the problems. And I want to reflect, it'll have to be briefly with you, but on 4 ways of thinking that, in my discipline, people try and make sense of these sorts of frameworks. I want to talk about the human rights aspects, and in each of them I want to talk about very briefly how they work and some of the things we need to do to move this agenda forward within those paradigms, and some of the things that are challenging to them. There's a set of issues around data protection. There's a language around ownership which I think is wholly misleading, but at the same time quite powerful in people's minds, which are worth unpacking. And then there's what I think is the current agenda we're taking forward, which is exploring the idea, and Liam touched on this right at the end, around what is the mutuality that's involved in the contract between the public provision of health services and people who use them to support the involvement of this sort of agenda. So quickly on the human rights paradigm, you can put this in a number of different ways. This is a formulation based on the European Convention on Human Rights, and it's about how do we respect people's privacy. So in the European Convention, we have Article 8, which says we have to respect people's private and family lives, but it's not absolute. So we have to balance it against other competing factors. We have to do that with a degree of proportion. And the 2 obvious ones that are picked up in the European Convention are something rather vaguely called public health and morals, which used to be about prostitution and things when it was first formulated. And we may come back to some of those sorts of questions later on. And the rights and freedoms of others. And we have to have that balancing exercise in a way which is done within a legal framework and balances in a way that we think is proportionate, a word that Liam used. Now, an awful lot of what we do is an avoidance strategy about avoiding that model biting. Because if there is no contact with people's private lives, because if the data is genuinely anonymised, the courts have accepted that it ceases to be a privacy issue, and as a result, instead of doing the balancing exercise, what we talk about is the fact that we needn't be anxious about our privacy. So I don't know where it's gone, that set of records down on the floor. As an example of that, you anonymise it, you extract it, you enable people to process it, but it can't be tracked back and therefore it doesn't impact on me. And we know that the courts will accept that because they've had to look at that in terms of prescribing records and how they're used. Now I think when we work with that model, what we need to be doing in the context we're talking about is thinking about rebalancing, thinking about the concept of proportionality. And the idea of this slide is that the work we have done has all been about trying to persuade people that the harms are not nearly as bad as they feared. So we think about proper governance controls to access to the information. We think about the fact that if you can't make it a non-privacy issue by anonymisation, you can reduce the risks by pseudonymisation. You can create controls to stop people hacking in using encryption. And actually that goes an awful long way to addressing what we think might go wrong. There's still a set of issues about people's perceptions about what might go wrong, and again, I didn't know, but Liam's touched on that. There are a lot easier ways to get hold of the information than through the electronic records, but it doesn't stop people having greater anxieties about the electronic context. And I think we put quite a lot of effort into those sides of things. I think we put a lot less effort into the bit of rebalancing, which is about saying the proportionality tips not just by reducing the harm, but also by enhancing the benefits that are to be gained and persuading people that actually this is worth doing. And the more you can create the weight of benefit, the less you are offset by the risks of harm. So we need to be talking up, and there's again some overlap here with what Liam was saying. I'm glad I got stratification, not just personalisation. There's a whole load of stuff around the use of data to make the service more responsive. I remember reading a few years ago a piece about Tesco's and Terry Leahy, who at that stage was one of the people thought was a guru for the NHS, talking about how they had heat sensors as they arrived in the Tesco stores, because they knew that about 30 minutes later you'd have people at the checkout. So if you knew a lot of people arrived, you could plan where you deposited your staff. And I remember asking at the time my local acute trust, as an NHS commissioner, so you know people book for surgery, why can't you use more theatre time at the time when you know they're coming? And this apparently is completely unreasonable and impossible, and still hasn't happened. So there's something about saying if we did this well, we wouldn't just improve research, we could make the system better, we could understand things better, we could improve public health. And we've really failed, I think, in this discourse of human rights to use in that balancing exercise the fact that we have rights to health and healthcare as well as privacy rights. But that's been largely lost, at least in my discipline's discussion. So there's some thoughts on the process, and I think there's some real problems about how we take account of various sorts of matters. Because what we've allowed is the idea that this is about my privacy and somebody else's gain. So we've found ourselves in a worry about the balance of interest between the majority, who isn't me, and me, who bears all the costs. So this perceived harm that I spoke about on the previous slide works its way through as being all visited on the patient, who's the data subject, and somehow the gains aren't expected to get there. And we need to reconceive the way we take account of those values. We need to ask ourselves whether or not we can make the case that says, actually, this is something we hold in common. We all hold the very same interests, and therefore we're aggregating something that is of benefit to each of us individually. Or maybe we need to argue that the net effect of this is a benefit that we all gain from. It's a shared gain, and therefore this is a community benefit, which, as part of the community, I should be expected to support. But we need to bear in mind when we do that, there's an awful lot of suspicion around what do we think of the state, and this would play out differently in different countries. How suspicious are we of the motives of researchers? Do we think that the profit motive in pharma is completely different? I find that very hard to sustain as a concrete distinction because the boundaries are very blurred. But it plays out, for example, in discussions being had at the moment about the proposals to sequence 100,000 genomes, about how we make sure that we don't get permission to do that on the basis that people think was a fraud, because actually there'll be various private companies involved. So that's the main paradigm, I think, that most lawyers and ethicists have talked about in different ways, and comes down to that right of privacy. Second paradigm, data protection, does see itself as rooted in that, but the big issues about this is its solution is based on a set of governance models. And it has an idea that actually we can meet those privacy concerns by thinking about who's in charge, who's responsible, and how we control usage. So the data protection regimes visit responsibilities on the organisations that control the data. They explain what's going on in terms of is it justified to use it, and almost all the discussion that comes from the privacy model focuses on the need for consent. If you look at all the data protection legislation and directives, they're very clear that medical purposes, which explicitly includes research, is a justified usage. But we've not been very bold in pushing that forward, and particularly the GMC created a lot of difficulty about that by taking a cautious view of the law. But we get lots of things from that help us in terms of records are no use if they're not usable, so structure in the way that's there, integrity issues. And we get a bit of a way of discussing how do we balance people's anxieties in terms of the sorts of rights that they should have. Rights to see what's there, rights to correct if things are inaccurate, and rights, but they're much more limited than people sometimes think, to withdraw data from processing in cases where it would cause them undue harm and distress. But I think this is a really difficult one to see working in the world that's emerging, because it's a way of thinking about it which works for biobanks, where you pull data together and you have someone controlling it. But actually the world is changing very rapidly. We've got lots of collections which are not driven by the normal approval, ethical guidelines. They're patient-driven. I'm sure many of you have seen the Google flu mapping process, which shows that Google can produce, by people's search histories, a map that pretty, well, for practical purposes, matches well enough the CDC data for you to take decisions on it. And we've got a whole way which we are thinking about linking of data sets. So the Nuffield Council on Bioethics, of which I'm the chair, has just launched a working party looking at this not from the point of view of biobanking control of data, but from the point of view about the issues that come by linking genomic data, health records, social care databases, to explore whether or not our current concepts of privacy and data protection are going to be fit for purpose in that world. So I think it made some sense, but it probably doesn't help us going forward. What about the ownership paradigm? I heard this a number of times, people talking about their genetic information as being theirs. At the Caldecott review, which will, I think, report shortly, we were questioned when I went to give evidence to it around, was ownership a useful concept? And I don't think it is. Quickly, why not? Well, is the information that goes in these data sets really owned by the people it's about? This was an issue I learnt about when I was a first-year student doing Roman law. And the metaphor from Roman law was, you have a piece of canvas and a pile of paints, and an artist paints a picture. Whose picture is it? The picture is made up of a whole load of materials, but the thing we value is the creative activity. Now, you observe me, you take my pulse, you take some tests. That's a really useful thing, but the creative exercise that goes into that isn't principally by me, it's by principally you and your colleagues. And so the idea that this product of labour becomes the person who you're working on as opposed to the person who did the work fits pretty poorly with the ideas about why we believe ownership's important. But even if we did think that the data subjects owned that data, rather than, I think more plausibly, that you would all own it if you did the trials, of course ownership doesn't really answer the questions we're interested in, because all systems of ownership have limitations of various sorts. You can't use everything for the reasons you want to use it. You can't go around stabbing people with a knife just because you own it. And one of the big debates is about whether or not to own something gives you the right to destroy it. A big issue in terms of the data usage. We are perfectly familiar, if not comfortable, with the idea that you may own it, but it doesn't mean that other people don't have some claim against it. An obvious example is taxation. And equally, if you own something and it causes harm to somebody else, you're accountable and responsible for what it does. And even if you get beyond that, the model of ownership that people talk about is it's mine and nobody else's, the private ownership model. And of course, that's not the only ownership models that we have. And if we talk about genetic data, it's pretty implausible to say it's mine and nobody else's. It's probably mine and a whole load of other people to whom I'm related. So I think that's a red herring. I think where we are going, a couple more slides left, is more of a discussion about the social contract. And we have a very local example of that in England. The NHS Constitution, I've dated it 2013A refresh because they've already said there's going to be 2 this year because they have to respond to the Francis inquiry. This was a document that was going to last for 10 years, and I think this is the 4th revision in the 4 years of its existence. But it's introduced something that begins to set up the debate that Liam left us with, which is the NHS is pledging to make sure that when people look after you, they have access to your health information. That's about improving the quality of our record keeping. But also to anonymise that information, to use it to support research to improve care for others, and even if you can't do it anonymously, to pledge to use it unless you opt out where it's possible for you to opt out. So we're setting up a refresh, a new social contract that very much takes the line that Liam's picking up, that actually this is a deal. You're getting benefits from it, and it's reasonable to expect you, unless you have really clear reasons to object, to allow us to do those things. And I think the key things for that for us are around making sure that that sticks by not losing trust. And that's where I think the issue about commercial research becomes really important, because it plays much more strongly in people's minds than it really deserves to. But if that's what's going on, we may lose the trust. I personally think we need to be pretty hard-nosed about this. Now, you can say there's a social contract and you have lots of opt-outs, or you can say you opt in or opt out, you don't have to do it, but it's a package. Now, that's a bit hard for us to do while the NHS is the only provider, but it will become easier and easier as the NHS provision fragments, and be much easier to in other sorts of systems. But the essence of this is, if it's a contract, we have to sell it to people and they need to agree. And when I was doing a little bit of work in preparation for this, I was discovering that my understanding of the John Stowe myth was a little bit different from what a Lancet paper argued the reality was about 13 years ago, in two respects. One is, in my mind, he ripped the handle off the pump himself, and in his own account, apparently he persuaded the local council that it should happen, and it did. And secondly, I thought the map generated the thesis, but I now understand that the map confirmed it. Now, all of that is part of thinking, how does the data help us to act? And I think it's consistent, therefore, with John Snow's legacy to think about the task of people like ourselves. So if we do believe this is a way forward, we have to sell that message and persuade people that it's an appropriate thing to do. Thank you very much.